April 8, 1943, RAF Debden's 4th Fighter Group finally put all 3 squadrons up in P-47Cs for a high-altitude fighter sweep, Circus 280, toward Saint-Omer, inaugurating the Jug's European baptism under American colors. Only weeks earlier, a first attempt at P-47 operations had stumbled when American radios faltered over France, forcing a hasty refit with British sets before missions resumed on April 8. From above, veteran FW-190 pilots circled like hawks and cracked jokes about the Thunderbolt's bulk, flying milk bottles, as the new arrivals clawed through cold, thin air on turbocharged lungs. Those opening sorties exposed every rookie seam in the platform and the unit, from formation coordination at 25,000 to 30,000 feet to the Jug's unfamiliar torque and dive behavior in the stratosphere. German fighters tried to force turning contests where the lighter FW-190 A-series excelled, while American leaders pushed to keep fights vertical and energy-driven. An approach the 4th would soon hone. Although uneventful on the scoreboard, April 8th taught a crucial lesson. The P-47 wasn't a Spitfire stand-in, it was a high-altitude battering ram that had to fight on its own terms. The first real clash came fast, April 15, 1943, when Major Donald Blakeslee of the 335th Fighter Squadron scored the P-47's first air victory, downing an FW-190 and proving the Jug could cash its altitude advantage when handled aggressively. Blakeslee's background in RAF Eagle Squadron tactics helped the 4th pivot from cautious escorts to confident sweeps that baited German fighters into energy fights they couldn't always control at height. Within a month, the group began regular escorts, learning to meet bombers at altitude and peel off to intercept interceptors before they could organize attacks. At 27,000 feet and higher, the P-47's turbo-supercharged R-2800 kept power where the FW-190's BMW 801 began to fade, flipping initiative to the heavier American fighter in thin air. The Jug still couldn't match Anton series roll snap or low-altitude climb, but from top cover it could dive like a dropped anvil, strike through a 6-foot gun convergence, and rocket back into a zoom climb. German pilots discovered that what looked like an easy mark in a flat turn became a runaway locomotive when the Jug went vertical. Early teething issues weren't just about radios. Pilots battled oxygen management, heating, and compressibility onset in steep dives, surprises that demanded new discipline in the cockpit. Ground crews learned fast too, adapting maintenance rhythms to the turbo-supercharger's heat and plumbing so sorties could keep pace with the 8th Air Force's expanding bomber schedule. By late April, the 4th's tone shifted from skepticism to muscle memory as formations tightened, altitudes went up, and the first victories reset morale. German milk bottle jokes persisted on the radios, but the film from gun cameras began to tell a different story as P-47 bursts cut clean through FW-190s that mistimed an escape dive. The Jug's 850s didn't just hit hard, they hit long, sustaining fire where cannon-armed opponents rationed bursts, which mattered in deflection snapshots at altitude. By the end of April, the 4th was no longer learning if the P-47 could fight. It was learning how to make that fight inevitable at 25,000 feet and above.
In mid-1940, as reports from Europe detailed armor, firepower, and altitude realities the USAF had not yet fielded, the USAAF called for a high-altitude interceptor that could meet and beat the Luftwaffe above 25,000 feet, triggering a design pivot that would birth the XP-47B. Alexander Kartveli, now at Republic Aviation after Seversky's reorganization, looked at the initial lightweight proposals and concluded they would not survive the new war. Instead, he drew a heavier, faster, and far more powerful machine built around a turbocharged Pratt Whitney R 2800 and an 8-gun battery. The decision was radical in 1940 terms. Rather than chase minimal weight and tight turning, Kartveli prioritized high-altitude energy, dive speed, structural strength, and sustained fire, an American answer to a European question about how to win where the air thins. The new prototype, designated XP-47B, serial number 403051, rolled out at Farmingdale, Long Island with its defining feature hidden inside. A General Electric turbosupercharger mounted aft with long exhaust and intake ducting running through the rear fuselage to maintain sea-level power in the stratosphere. This big lung layout moved hot, bulky hardware out of the nose, letting the R-2800 breathe efficiently at height while keeping the propeller shaft short and robust for the enormous loads of a high-power, high-altitude dive profile. The choice committed the design to size and mass, but it also gave the Republic fighter a service ceiling over 40,000 feet and climb, speed, and recovery behavior few contemporaries could match when the altimeter wound past 30,000. On May 6, 1941, test pilot Lowry Brabham lifted the XP-47B from the Republic field and ferried it to Mitchell Field, fighting a cockpit haze from oil ignited in the hot turbo exhaust duct. He landed, still confident enough to tell the team, "I think we've hit the jackpot." First trials showed speed and altitude potential were real, even if teething troubles appeared immediately in areas like heat management, canopy function, and high-altitude control forces. But the Republic and the Army Air Forces saw enough to push ahead, and orders followed even as engineers drew up modifications to cure issues discovered on the prototype. The armament philosophy was as bold as the power plant: 8 Browning AN M2.5 caliber machine guns, 4 per wing with roughly 425 rounds per gun, for a total of about 3,400 rounds. An endurance advantage that changed how deflection shots and pursuit bursts worked in real combat. Where cannon-armed fighters often rationed 120 to 200 shells per gun, the Jug's long belts meant pilots could hold the trigger through a deflection window and still have ammunition to make a second pass minutes later. This wasn't conjecture. Specification sheets and unit practices converged on 425 RPG as a typical European theater loadout, with harmonization around a few hundred yards to create a dense 6-foot-wide kill cone. Structurally, the XP-47B was overbuilt for fighter standards in 1940, with the mass and wing planform to carry heavy guns, deep belts, armor, and later bombs and rockets without surrendering the altitude game the turbocharger enabled. The shift from fabric to MET control surfaces cured rupture and stiffness issues found in early testing, while pressurized ignition and refined ducting helped tame arcing and heat in the thin, cold air up high. Republic iterated fast, moving lessons from the XP-47B into the B and C production blocks, then into the D series that would define the type's combat heyday. From the start, numbers told the story of intent. P-47C and early D specifications recorded maximum level speeds in the 420 to 430 miles per hour class at roughly 30,000 feet, with a service ceiling around 42,000 feet and a climb to 15,000 feet in just over 7 minutes for early combat blocks. Those figures were not academic. They meant the Jug could start above a fight, pick a moment, dive into a firing pass at very high true airspeed, then zoom back toward thin air safety, where the supercharger curves still favored the American engine. It also meant the airplane reacted differently than smaller liquid-cooled fighters. Energy was the coin, not angles, and Republic's Dinosaur carried a bigger wallet at altitude. The R-2800 Double Wasp itself was a masterstroke for this mission. 18 cylinders in 2 rows, air-cooled robustness, and the temperature headroom to tolerate combat damage that would end any liquid-cooled engine's day the instant a radiator or line was holed. Turbocharging, instead of only mechanical supercharging, allowed the XP-47B and its successors to preserve manifold pressure as density fell, a decisive advantage when opponents' engines began to gasp above the mid-20s. Republican GE's packaging put the turbo where airflow and structure could handle heat and duct length, a trade that cost weight but bought the high-altitude dominance that became the Jug's calling card. Teething pains were real, and they were addressed in engineering sprints. Canopy jams led to a refined sliding canopy with emergency jettison, ignition arcing drove a pressurized system upgrade, and fabric control surfaces gave way to all-metal units to stop high-altitude ruptures. Engine installation and fuel system kinks were hammered flat as production moved from B to C with standardized fixes, while the turbosupercharger regulator on the R2821 helped smooth altitude transitions under combat throttle. By the time the P-47C hit operational strength, the Tyke had shed many prototype gremlins and retained the core that mattered: power at height, dive authority, and a gun battery that stayed lethal shot after shot. What looks, in hindsight, like inevitable success was nothing but in 1940-41, when betting on a single-engine 7-ton fighter seemed heretical next to the era's slimmer interceptors. Yet the European air war had already shown that survivability, altitude performance, and firepower, delivered consistently, mattered more than pure turn rate once escort ranges grew and fights moved higher. The XP-47B embodied that lesson, and its first flight, with smoke in the cockpit and a test pilot's grin on landing, marked the moment the USAAF's high-altitude problem had a viable American-style solution. As the line matured, the design's initial logic paid further dividends. The big airframe accepted external tanks for range, and later blocks added dive flaps, better props, and systems refinements without breaking the airplane's essential energy profile. Even before the famous paddle blade prop of mid-war D-blocks, the Jug's identity was set. Climb to where the turbo sings, dive like a hammer, and let 8 Brownings write the rest of the paragraph. Engineers had not built a Spitfire with an American accent. They had built a high-altitude sled engineered for a war of attrition, and that choice changed the strategic arithmetic over Europe. By the specifications, the skeptics got their answer: a single-engine fighter with a ceiling near 42,000 feet, level speeds well over 400 miles per hour at operational altitudes, and a standard combat armament that could put 3,400 rounds into the air before running dry. On the ramp, armor plate, bullet-resistant glass, and a robust radial engine described a machine that could be shot to pieces and still bring a pilot home, an outcome recorded again and again once the Jug went to war. And on the drawing board, the rear-mounted turbo and deep-wing structure announced that this fighter was designed to own the vertical, not to win a ballroom dance. The prototype, XP-47B, would be lost in an accident in August 1942, a reminder that rapid wartime development extracted a price even as solutions arrived just in time. But its legacy was already in production runs rolling out of Farmingdale and soon Evansville, translating a bold concept into hundreds and then thousands of airframes that the 8th and 9th Air Forces would leverage across 2 very different air wars. From a 1940 panic to a 1941 first flight and into 1942 production, the Jug's creation arc showed how quickly American industry could turn design bets into combat facts when the requirement was clear and the altitude was high.
The 56th Fighter Group's first months on the Jug were unforgiving. Pilots wrestled with torque on takeoff, long ground rolls, and a heavy airframe that punished slow, low-altitude maneuvering, leading to early accidents while the unit learned the airplane's personality.
Zemke recorded that the P-47 accelerated poorly from slow speed and needed nearly a half-mile just to climb out cleanly, which forced stricter discipline on speeds, spacing, and power management during departures and recoveries. High-altitude dives revealed a new hazard: compressibility, when airflow over the wings approached transonic and control forces stiffened or froze, as seen in the November 13, 1942 Comstock Dyer incidents, where both recovered only after descending into denser air. Republic and the AAF responded by institutionalizing recovery training and later adding dive recovery flaps on P-47D blocks to tame high-speed pullouts and standardize procedures for getting out of the thin air trap safely. Pilots who mastered the jug stopped trying to out-turn opponents and started aiming it. Robert S. Johnson likened the sensation to strapping onto a locomotive, a reminder that mass, stability, and forward firepower were the point. The air-cooled R-2800 lacked vulnerable coolant plumbing and sat behind armor and bullet-resistant glass, so the aircraft could soak up punishment that would down liquid-cooled types, then answer with 8 Brownings and 3,400 rounds through a tight convergence that unraveled targets in seconds. Zemke drilled the group to fight vertically, climb to 30,000 feet, roll inverted, dive at maximum power, fire a short dense burst through the 6-foot kill cone, then convert speed into a zoom climb to reset the fight on their terms. That regimen turned initial skepticism into muscle memory, and by spring 1943, the Wolfpack's discipline at altitude made the jug's heavy frame feel like a scalpel in the dive, rather than a burden in the turn.
June 26, 1943. The 61st Fighter Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group was escorting bombers over occupied France when Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying tail-end Charlie in a P-47C, was bounced by FW-190s and brutally hit before he could react. His Thunderbolt took multiple 20-millimeter strikes that shattered the canopy, blew instruments apart, sprayed the cockpit with oil and hydraulic fluid, and wounded Johnson as the aircraft snapped into an inverted spin high over the Channel coast. Pinned in his seat with the canopy jammed, he leveled the crippled jug and turned for England, flying nearly blind behind an oil-smeared windscreen while fighting a shuddering engine and sluggish controls. A lone FW-190 caught up and made repeated stern attacks, emptying its remaining ammunition into the stricken P-47 until the German pilot finally pulled alongside, stared in disbelief, and then broke away. An episode that became a unit legend, even as historians noted some details remain contested. Accounts differ on the attacker's identity, with claims ranging from an unknown JG-26 pilot to suggestions involving Egon Meyer, while 56th FG pilot Gerald Johnson later wrote that he downed an FW-190 attacking Robert but kept quiet at the time to avoid spoiling his glory. What is not in dispute is that Robert Johnson kept flying a P-47 that should not have stayed in the air long enough for any second act. Johnson brought the wreck to Manston, where ground crew stopped counting at well over 200 bullet holes, and the airframe was subsequently written off from damage, while Johnson returned to combat within days. The incident hardened the group's faith in the Thunderbolt's survivability and spread quickly through both USAAF and Luftwaffe circles as a cautionary tale about what an air-cooled R-2800 behind armor and 850s could endure and still bring home.
Johnson would go on to score 27 victories with the 56th, but the day his jug refused to die did as much for the airplane's reputation as any tally he posted later. Hub Zemke reshaped the 56th Fighter Group's doctrine around altitude and energy, ordering his pilots to ride 4,000 to 5,000 feet above the bomber stream so they could roll inverted, dive hard, fire in a compressed window, and zoom back to thin air before the enemy could answer. He warned that any turn fight below roughly 230 miles per hour was a death trap in a jug. The cure was discipline. Stay fast, stay high, and shoot through the convergence, not around it. With 8 Brownings and about 3,400 rounds on board, the P-47 could hold a burst long enough to make imperfect aim fatal, a practical edge over cannon-armed foes that rationed 120 to 200 shells per gun. Gun harmonization typically set the streams to meet near 300 yards, creating a 6-foot-wide kill cone that punished head-on and quartering shots. Pilots trained to fly the Pipper through that zone and then be gone before the counterattack. Zemke also pushed escort doctrine to keep fighters flexible, close enough to protect, high enough to pounce, so interceptors met a wall of speed and fire as they assembled for runs on the bombers. The result was a group that owned the vertical, hit from above, break the formation, and reset the fight at altitude while the bombers kept steady to target. Schweinfurt Regensburg, August 17, 1943, exposed the cost of running out of escort. 60 of 376 B-17s were lost when Luftwaffe units rearmed between the staggered attacks and mauled the unescorted stream. But when P-47s were on station, they shattered attacks, with the 56th claiming multiple formations broken and dozens of fighters checked before they could mass on the bomber boxes.
The mid-war P-47D updates with the big Hamilton Standard paddle blade prop changed the opening seconds of every fight. More bite at low IAS and in thin air boosted climb and acceleration, so the jug could meet a bounce climbing instead of only diving away. Pilots reported that the cut-in felt immediate, throttle up, RPM set, and the broad-chord blades hauled mass into the vertical without that old lag, shrinking the window where a BF-109 or FW-190 could get separation uphill. On paper and in tests, paddle blade D-blocks showed a clear climb rate gain and crisper energy build, enough to force German fighters to rethink their safe escape envelopes above 20,000 feet. The other revolution hung under the wings. External tanks, particularly the British-built 108-gallon paper tanks, which could be carried as twins on the wings, with optional 75 or 150-gallon centerline tanks for deep legs. Twin 108s turned what had been a tight combat radius into workable escort legs that kept P-47s with bomber streams far deeper into Germany, dropping tanks just before the merge to arrive at the fight with the new prop's improved acceleration ready to cash in. By late 1943 and into 1944, standard Thunderbolt loadouts mixed twin 108s for ingress with a centerline tank when needed, and the units refined fuel burns and step climbs to keep top cover stacked at 25 to 30,000 feet. When D-Day came, Thunderbolts patrolled from sea level to the high teens over the assault corridors and hammered road and rail beyond the beachhead, while higher cover kept the air quiet enough that only a handful of German aircraft reached the invasion front. In the months leading to June 6th, systematic attacks on airfields, rail yards, and depots set the table, and on the day itself, hundreds of USAAF and RAF fighters, many of them P-47s, cycled continuous caps and strike sorties to choke movement and blind defenders. The combination of range from tanks and responsiveness from paddle blades meant the jug could launch, escort, shed weight, and then function as flying artillery the minute the ground commander called. From the bocage to the breakout, 9th Air Force P-47s made the battlefield move, or stop, on demand, patrolling over columns, cutting rails,
dropping bridges and smashing road traffic so thoroughly that daylight German movement often meant swift destruction. Official after-action tallies from tactical commands record sustained runs of vehicles, guns, and rolling stock destroyed or disabled, with Thunderbolt groups flying armored column cover and on-call strikes that silenced gun posts and knocked out tanks within minutes of radioed requests. The method was relentless: armed reconnaissance in depth to find and fix, then rockets, 500s and 1000s, and 850s to finish, repeated until roads and rails became kill zones. While Europe wound down in 1945, a different Thunderbolt evolved for the Pacific, the P-47N, with wet wings holding 93 gallons each, a larger span, and total fuel capacity up to roughly 1,266 gallons with externals, enough for about 2,350 miles of range. The N model kept the R-2800, but paired it with a larger turbo installation and long-range props to cruise far, escorting B-29s and sweeping between island bases where the map demanded endurance first and speed second. It was the Jug's final form, still 8.50s, still brutally tough, but now designed to cross the ocean and return with fuel to fight when it arrived. Even jets didn't end the conversation. Late-war P-47M units hunted for chances rather than drag races, takeoff, landing, or a dive from height, and bagged Me-262s when timing and firepower aligned. Major George Bostwick of the 63rd FS scored against a 262 near the pattern at Parcham on March 25, 1945, a reminder that while speed set the terms, the Jug could still write the last line if the shot presented.
New Year's Day 1945 opened with Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise, low-level strike by roughly 850 Luftwaffe fighters against Allied airfields in the Low Countries, intended to smash tactical air power on the ground in a single blow. The result was catastrophic for Germany. About 271 fighters destroyed and 213 fighter pilots killed or missing, losses irreplaceable in the regime's final months. At the same time, Allied units replaced aircraft within days and resumed operations. Even generous estimates of Allied losses emphasize the asymmetry. Hundreds of Allied aircraft were written off or damaged, yet backfilled rapidly. In contrast, the Luftwaffe never recovered its veteran cadre after the raid. Why the Jug kept flying. Bodenplatte underscored a strategic truth already visible after Normandy. Allied air forces, heavily staffed with P-47 groups in 9th Air Force, could regenerate faster than the Luftwaffe could replace pilots, parts, or fuel. Thunderbolt groups were back on schedule within a week, cycling armed recces and close support while Luftwaffe formation shrank, a dynamic that turned every attempted German counterstroke into further attrition. That imbalance was built in factories long before it appeared in combat reports over Belgium and the Netherlands. Evansville and the numbers that mattered. Republic's Evansville plant alone produced about 6,242 P-47s, nearly 2 out of every 5 Thunderbolts, while total wartime output reached roughly 15,683 aircraft, the most of any American fighter. By early 1945, Evansville was building bubble-top D blocks and then P-47N long-range variants, hitting milestones like the 5,000 airframe in March and sustaining output until the final stop order in September. Those lines absorbed engineering changes, paddle blade props, dive recovery flaps, and dorsal fillets without breaking cadence, so frontline groups received upgrades alongside replacements. Design that scaled under fire. The D-Series matured from Razorback to Bubbletop with structural and systems refinements, culminating in late D-30, D-40 blocks that added dive brakes and tail mods for stability and recovery at high speed. Shifts between Hamilton Standard and Curtiss Electric propellers were integrated directly into block production,
letting units field climb and acceleration improvements amid ongoing operations. Because the P-47 was overbuilt from the start, those modifications nested cleanly, without undermining the airplane's high-altitude, high-energy identity. Tactical Air and the Ground War. 9th Air Force used Thunderbolts as the backbone of interdiction between spring 1944 and VE Day, striking bridges, marshalling yards, and road rail choke points to suffocate German maneuver. Forward controllers could divert P-47 sorties to urgent targets in minutes, which made the type feel like flying artillery to Army commanders pushing through the bocage and beyond the Seine. By doctrine and practice, tactical recces found, fixed, and finished, and the heavy 50s made even a short pass decisive against soft and lightly armored targets. Range, reattacks, and staying power. External tanks, especially the twin 108-gallon paper tanks, extended escort and strike legs so jug formations could arrive high, drop weight, and immediately pivot from cover to attack. That flexibility mattered on days when Luftwaffe fighters tried to mass, top cover broke formations, then the same flights retasked to cut rails or smash columns within the hour. After Bodenplatte, this adaptability meant the difference between a one-day shock and a functional interruption. For the Allies, it was the latter. Training, turnover, and fielding. Tactical success rode on throughput. The U.S. system fielded new pilots and crew at scale, while standardized maintenance and spares kept P-47 availability high near the front. Ground echelons learned to swap props, guns, and turbos under field conditions, compressing downtime even after flak-heavy missions. The Luftwaffe's pilot pipeline, by contrast, had been hollowed out by years of attrition, fuel shortages, and accelerated and uneven training. Why 850s work in practice. The Jug's 8 AN-2M50s carried about 425 rounds per gun, roughly 3,400 per aircraft, giving pilots a sustained fire advantage that turned brief deflection windows into lethal envelopes. Where cannon-armed opponents rationed shells, Thunderbolt pilots could ride a stable pipper through a 6-foot convergence at around 300 yards and keep firing long enough to guarantee hits. Gun camera analysis and field reports repeatedly showed mid-air breakups when targets crossed that zone in a dive or quartering pass. Altitude and the turbo advantage. The GE turbosupercharger kept manifold pressure in thin air, preserving R2800 power well past 25,000 feet and pushing service ceiling to roughly 42,000 feet. That meant the P-47s could choose when to enter and exit, and a steep dive from top cover stacked true airspeed and mass into ferocious first-pass effects. It also meant the airplane's weight penalty inverted at altitude, where opponents' engines ran out of breath while the Jug still had throttle in hand. From D to M and N, finishing the job. Late-war D-30, D-40 blocks brought stability and recovery aids just as escort legs expanded and tactical demands intensified over France, Belgium, and Germany. The P-47M specialized for speed near the endgame, hunting jets by timing rather than drag race, while the Pacific-bound P-47N stretched its wings and fuel for island hopping and B-29 escort. Together, they showed the airframe's elasticity, sprint when needed, cruise when required, and always carry enough gun to settle an argument in seconds. What Bodenplatte made obvious. The Luftwaffe's New Year's gamble could destroy aircraft and crater flight lines, but it couldn't conjure veteran pilots or restore fuel and factories already lost to months of attrition and interdiction. Allied fields filled again with jugs within days, while German Gruppen flew with fewer leaders and shorter rosters for the rest of the war. From the front line view, it looked like resilience. From the factory floor, it was simply a schedule. From D-Day to VE Day, Thunderbolt units claimed roughly 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks destroyed, a level of interdiction that strangled movement and repair capacity behind the front. Across the war, P-47s flew hundreds of thousands of sorties, over 700,000 in some tallies, with about 3,752 air-to-air victories credited in the European theater, while maintaining one of the lowest loss rates among Allied fighter bombers. 9th Air Force reporting adds the scale of ammunition and ordnance, well over 100 million .50 caliber rounds fired, 120,000 tons of bombs dropped, and tens of thousands of HVARs launched in support of ground forces. Post-war assessments and museum fact sheets emphasize why the numbers look the way they do. A robust R-2800 radial, an airframe that tolerated punishment, and 850s that let even a brief tracking solution become decisive. German pilots who dismissed the Jug early reversed themselves by 1944-45, citing its dive, resilience, and lethal gunnery. Even Adolf Gallen's later recollections include being downed by a P-47 near war's end. Among USAF commanders and curators, the P-47 sits beside the P-51 and P-38 as a premier American fighter, distinct not by range alone, but by how it fused altitude, firepower, and survivability into a reliable, repeatable effect. The 56th Fighter Group's record tells the story in miniature: 677.5 air victories claimed and 311 ground victories at the cost of 128 aircraft, while still preferring the Jug even as other 8th Air Force groups transitioned to Mustangs. Pilots like Francis Gabby Grabeski and Robert S. Johnson built their tallies in P-47s, and their gun camera strips show why. When the Pipper crossed the convergence zone, airplanes became debris fields in a heartbeat. It was not just a big fighter, it was a dependable system that let ordinary crews achieve extraordinary, repeatable outcomes under pressure.
The P-47's numbers read like design intent written in metal: altitude first, firepower always, and enough structure to carry upgrades without losing the airplane's core identity. Total production reached 15,683 airframes across all variants, with Evansville and Farmingdale building Razorbacks and Bubble Tops side by side as block changes rolled in. Late D blocks standardized dive recovery flaps, dorsal fin fillets, and provisions for 10 zero-length rocket stubs, while the bubble canopy improved sightlines for deflection shots and low-level awareness. Power plant and turbo. The Pratt Whitney R-2800, coupled to a GE turbosupercharger mounted in the rear fuselage, kept manifold pressure at altitude and gave the Jug its signature vertical game above 25,000 feet. The system's long ducting, intercooler, and control regulators demanded careful maintenance, but paid for itself every time a pilot chose when to enter and leave a flight at 30,000 feet. Quick engine change modules, adopted from early C-Series lessons, let line crews swap engines faster and get airframes back on the line under field conditions. Armament. 8 wing-mounted AN M250s, usually 425 rounds per gun, for roughly 3,400 total, delivered about 13 pounds of lead per second when fired together. Standard belts mixed AP, API, and APIT to cut, ignite, and trace into a 6-foot convergence zone around 300 yards, which made brief tracking windows decisive. Ground attack fit expanded from 250, 500, and 1,000-pound GP bombs to napalm and the 5-inch HVAR. Late D-40s could mount up to 10 HVARs on zero-length stubs. Rockets and bombs. The 5-inch HVAR packed general-purpose or armor-piercing warheads and could punch through feet of reinforced concrete, making it ideal for rail cuts, bunkers, and bridge disabling. Field photos and manuals show mixed loads, 3 500s with 4 HVARs on some test fits. Operationally, groups often flew 2 500s or a 1,000-pound centerline with rockets for flexible target sets. By July-September 1944, 9th Air Force squadrons were routinely employing HVARs in Normandy, integrating rockets into the strike rhythm alongside strafing and bombs. Airframe evolution. Razorbacks gave way to bubble tops, starting with the D-25 production blocks, adding visibility and, later, a dorsal fillet to cure yaw issues from the cut-down spine. Dive recovery flaps under each wing standardized high-speed pull-out behavior, taming compressibility events and saving airframes that would once have run out of elevator authority. The net effect was confidence at speed. Pilots could dive harder, pull sooner, and rely on predictable feel through recovery instead of praying for thicker air. Loads and turnaround. A typical fighter-bomber fit might be 2 times 500-pound bombs plus a 150-gallon belly tank for ingress, dropping the tank short of the bomb line before attacks. Twin 108-gallon paper wing tanks and a 150-gallon centerline extended legs for escort or deep-armed reconnaissance, then came off for immediate combat handling. Maintenance crews worked the Jug's ample access panels and QECs to keep turbos breathing, props balanced, and gun bays belted. Recovery from flak or FOD damage was often measured in days, not weeks. Why these details mattered is visible in every gun camera strip and field report. Altitude control plus sustained fire turned fleeting geometry into outcomes, while dive recovery hardware and visibility upgrades converted pilot skill into repeatable, survivable tactics. The same airframe that escorted at 30,000 feet could, 2 hours later, rake a rail yard with HVARs and API belts, then climb out on the turbo to look for anything bold enough to leave cover. And when it came back, shot up, the radial, armor, and QEC philosophy meant another Jug would likely roll to the line before the day was out.
By late 1944, the effect of fighter-bombers on German units was psychological as well as physical, with ground troops and logistics crews treating daylight movement as an invitation to disaster and reporting heightened anxiety when Allied caps were audible in the distance. Studies on German morale conducted at war's end found persistent fear responses to recurring air attack, with fatigue, apathy, and reduced work output compounding the material damage from interdiction and strafing. Fighter-bomber pressure during the Ardennes fighting amplified this stress, as Luftwaffe support dwindled and ground units faced routine, responsive airstrikes that arrived within minutes of being called. German rail defense adapted quickly, mounting 20mm and 37mm flak on wagons so trains could fight back even while moving, which forced P-47 pilots to treat the locomotive as the first target and flak cars as the second. Thunderbolt veterans described the hazards: steam explosions, shrapnel, flying debris, and point defense tracers, turning a successful boiler hit into a debris field that had to be flown through or avoided instantly. Doctrine shifted accordingly. Attack perpendicular to track when possible.
breach the boiler to halt movement, then suppress flak cars before raking the consist with API belts. Captured and evaluated Thunderbolts at German test centers told the Luftwaffe what they were up against: high-altitude power, sustained .5 caliber fire, and rugged construction. Yet translating that knowledge to counters proved hard under fuel and pilot shortages. Post-war interrogation files and compiled assessments reflected a change in tone, charting the P-47 from minimal threat in early 1943 to critical threat by mid-1944 and effectively unsurvivable in direct engagement by 1945. Frontline reactions tracked the paperwork. Once the Jug's dive and gunnery strengths were widely known, veteran units tried to avoid vertical traps rather than test them a second time.
Slide the canopy, and what greets the pilot is a cockpit designed for a very American idea of endurance and effect. Wide-shouldered armor behind the seat, bullet-resistant glass up front, generous real estate for hands and feet, and instruments spaced for work at altitude rather than showroom beauty. The bubble-top D-Series transformed sightlines with a cut-down spine and blown canopy, letting pilots see the fight unfold in 360 degrees, and making deflection shooting far more intuitive than in the earlier Razorbacks. That visibility change did not come free. The early bubble tops lost keel area and needed a dorsal fin fillet added in P-47 D30-40 blocks to recover directional stability, an engineering trade made permanent in production once pilots reported the yaw looseness. Every lever and dial carried the subtle fingerprints of an airplane built to fight at 25,000 feet and above, starting with the Pratt Whitney R 2800's manifold pressure and mixture controls, married to a General Electric turbosupercharger that kept sea-level lungs in the stratosphere. The turbo sat back in the fuselage, fed with long, hot ducting with an intercooler and regulators that demanded careful setup and rewarded disciplined throttle hands with power in air so thin opponent superchargers were already wheezing. In restorations today, the turbo plumbing still reads like an engineering diagram you can walk through. Access doors, heat blankets, and duct sections that explain why the Jug's empty weight and moments are what they are, and why those wasted pounds bought the top cover choice pilots needed. The stick and rudder felt different than smaller fighters. There was heft, some called it dignity, to the inputs. A sense that the airplane waited for the pilot to set an energy plan and then paid it out with interest in the dive rather than dancing on a whim in a low-altitude turn. Dive recovery flaps under each wing arrived to make the high-speed pullout predictable, a fix to the compressibility bite that early testers and combat pilots learned about the hard way when controls stiffened near the transonic edge. Blunt-nosed ailerons and that dorsal fillet rounded out the field so that the Jug's high-speed personality became something to use, not fear. A machine that dove straight and true, then answered the pull without cruelty. The guns told the rest of the story. 8 Browning AN M2.50s, 4 per wing, with roughly 425 rounds per gun standard in the European theater, for a total of about 3,400 rounds, more than the total cannon ammunition load on many adversaries' fighters. Armor-piercing incendiary, API, and API-T were interleaved by armorers to both penetrate and set alight, with ball or SAP rounds blended as groups preferred, and it was common to tune belt recipes by squadron habit and target. Harmonization, where the bullet streams cross, was usually set near 300 yards, creating a roughly 6-foot circle where 8 separate trajectories converged into a density that turned a brief, imperfect tracking pass into a breakup on film. If the airplane's philosophy had a single equation, it lived at the bottom of a high-altitude dive. Mass times true airspeed delivered a short firing window in which sustained 50 cal fire filled space faster than a pilot could count. And then the zoom climb converted that kinetic surplus back into altitude before anyone below could get even. Pilots called it boom and zoom because they were practical men. But the method was as technical as it was tactical. Prop governor set, manifold and mixture set, trim for speed, Pipper walked through a target for a second and a half, then throttle forward and nose up into clean air. Gun camera strips from the period show why the 50 cal battery worked. A tail shears off, wings fold at the root, the canopy and panels erupt. Damage that looks cannon-like because massed small caliber hits sometimes do their destruction not by single dramatic blasts, but by cumulative structural shock. Bombs and rockets made the Jug a two-act fighter. Arrive high and dangerous, then, with tanks gone, drop to low altitude and fight the ground war with ordnance that matched the day's targets. 2 500-pound bombs or a single 1,000-pounder were routine, and late-war D-blocks standardized zero-length stubs for up to 10 5-inch HVRs, each roughly comparable to a 105mm artillery shell in effect, a portable artillery battery on call to the ground commander. Groups learned efficient mixes, a 1,000-pound centerline with 4 HVRs for hardened points, or 2 500s with 6 HVRs for rails and columns, with the 850s reserved for the finishing strokes that turned a disabled target into scrap. Field practice taught that trains fought back, flak wagons with 20mm or 37mm weighted mid-concert. So an ideal rail attack struck a locomotive first, boiler ruptured into a white-black blossom, then rolled down the concert to kill the guns before an exit turn took the pilot out of the steam shrapnel cloud. Bridges felt similar, aiming points, not targets, so Jugs briefed span or abutment, then walked HVRs or 500s into the structure until rail lines were simply points on maps that nobody used in daylight anymore. On roads, doctrine was cut and rake. Put a 500 on the mid-column, rake front and rear with API and tracer, then re-attack the survivors while friendly armor and infantry closed. Every minute a road was blocked was a minute an enemy couldn't maneuver. The reason this was sustainable had less to do with myth than maintenance. The Jug's big belly doors and wing bays were made to be opened, with access to guns, feed chutes, and turbos that let crew chiefs and armorers belt, swap, and safety check with a rhythm that matched the ambitions of a theater-wide campaign. Quick engine change modules kept power plants a logistics problem rather than a mystery. And spare props, Hamilton Standard or Curtis Electric by block, made repair times short enough that back on the line tomorrow was not a slogan but a schedule. When the airframe came back torn, the radial and armor meant the damage was to skin and accessories, not to a coolant system or fragile piping. And those were exactly the kinds of wounds a forward depot could stitch fast. At altitude, the numbers the pilot read were the point. A service ceiling near 42,000 feet, high 20s to low 30s where the turbo sang, and level speeds past 430 miles per hour in D-series trim. All figures that meant the Jug could start above the fight and decide whether to accept it. Water injection war emergency power added a brief controlled violence to the throttle's last half-inch of travel, pushing the R2800 towards 2300 to 2430 horsepower for climbs or escapes that couldn't wait. The big propellers, the Hamilton Standard paddle blades in particular, translated that power into bite at thin airspeeds where earlier blades felt anemic, turning the heavy Jug into a surprise climber when it mattered. It's tempting to see the airplane as just airframe and engine, but the Jug worked because it was also a belt-fed mathematics problem. 8 gun receivers, 8 heaters, 8 feed chutes, synchronized and warmed to keep jams rare in cold, thin, oil-streaked air. Armorers learned to count on those belts, and pilots learned to trust pacing. A 2-second burst now, another later, and enough left to make a third pass if the target had friends or guns. The sight picture was the human part. A clear bubble top, a gun sight moved by hands that knew how much lead felt right at 300 yards in a dive. And when those elements clicked, film frames became instruction manuals in how to make an enemy aircraft stop being an aircraft. Under the cockpit talk was production talk. Bubble-top P-47D blocks rolled out of Farmingdale and Evansville, with changes folded into the line so squadrons received upgrades alongside replacements, not as separate rare birds. Block numbers weren't trivia, they were capability labels. D-26 for the first bubble tops, D-28 with systems refinements, D-30 with dive brakes and dorsal fillets, D-40 with tail warning and structural tweaks, each nudge making the same fighter better at the job a pilot already knew. Curtiss Wright built P-47Gs identical to Republic D-Series Razorbacks to keep training units fed, a reminder that even the Jug's simplicity was planned. Teach at home, fight abroad, and never let a ground school become a bottleneck. The cockpit's daily life was procedural. Oxygen checks, interphone test, gun heat circuit, set prop governor, trim tabs, radiator and cowl flaps where needed, then climb profiles that matched fuel burns across main, auxiliary, and external tanks so the escort plan and re-attack plan could live in the same sortie. Pilots learned to brief harmonization and ammunition first, know where the bullets meet and what they are.
From the morning of D-Day onward, P-47 Thunderbolts treated northern France like a living map of vulnerable arteries, bridges, marshalling yards, junctions, and road hubs, and flew armed reconnaissance until travel by daylight felt like volunteering for destruction. Doctrine paired pre-planned strikes with on-call tasking from forward controllers, so rail cuts and road ambushes arrived at the speed of the ground battle rather than on a detached timetable. The rhythm quickly looked inevitable from below. A span cratered before an engineer detachment reached it, a locomotive gutted before a relief convoy could pass, a column split and raked until the road barricaded itself with wreckage. Loadouts built to break logistics. Thunderbolt squadrons tuned hardpoints to the day's target set, 2 500-pound GP bombs for most bridges and spans, a 1,000-pounder center line for heavier masonry, and late-war 5-inch HVARs on zero-length stubs for rails, bunkers, and hardened points. The HVAR put a 10.5mm class hit on a stable gun platform, letting pilots walk warheads across junctions and bridge work in seconds without sacrificing accuracy to recoil or drag. All the while, 850s with roughly 425 rounds per gun, about 3,400 total, gave the sortie endurance and firepower, turning even a short tracking window into a long list of perforations and ignitions. How to kill a train? Railway defenders adapted with flak wagons and dispersed guns, so tactics shifted to a 3-step pattern. Rupture the boiler first, no steam, no movement. Suppress the mid-consist flak car, then rake the train with API and tracer to burn cargo and morale together. Ideally, pilots cross the track at right angles to minimize exposure and simplify deflection, then egressed low and fast before steam, shrapnel, and point defense tracers converged in their wake. Against armored flak cars or stout spans, HVARs gave margin. Even a near miss could cut rails or shatter ballast enough to derail repairs and force traffic into pre-sighted detours. Altitude still ruled the low war. Even at treetop height, the Jug's low passes were paid for by an altitude decision made on the ramp. A GE turbosupercharger preserved manifold pressure above 25,000 feet, so flights could escort on the climb, drop tanks, descend to strike, and then climb back through flak belts with power in hand. A service ceiling near 42,000 feet let elements stack cover over ingress lanes in the bomb line, forcing any Luftwaffe attempt to mass through a layered gauntlet before it ever saw the heavies or the fighter bombers. In practice, that altitude card turned one type into two roles, high escort and low interdiction, so planners could schedule cuts and cover with the same squadrons. Range as a weapon?
The British built 108-gallon paper wing tanks, often paired or supplemented with a 150-gallon belly tank, stretched legs so P-47s were on station when a bridge needed to fall and still had the gas to re-attack after the first pass. Step climbs on externals, rendezvous at altitude, jettison under the umbrella, and then a controlled dive to the rail targets became a choreographed pattern squadrons repeated until it felt like a law of nature. What armed recce really was? Armed recon wasn't wandering. It was a route with intelligence cues, target priorities, and fallback nodes that kept guns and racks busy even when clouds or traffic didn't play along. Flight swept between choke points, watched for track marks, dust, smoke, and reflections, split into elements to work multiple nodes, and rejoined high enough to be retasked before fuel ran the day. Done right, each cut layered another constraint. A blown bridge pushed loads to a detour, a cut rail forced transshipment, and a ruined junction made the detour a trap. The Normandy grind in practice. D-Day was just the overture. By June 8th, group reports read like factory logs of violence. Dozens of tanks and vehicles destroyed, hutmen strafed, and roads made unusable for anything that burned gasoline. Forward engineers opened emergency strips within a day, moving P-47s across the channel so sortie rates rose, on-station time improved, and shot-up jugs no longer had to limp over water to reach a safe field. Under this tempo, armored counterattacks like Mortain withered. Pilots and controllers turned the sky into a switch that flicked off relief columns the moment they showed on the roads. The hazards and the fixes? Strafing was often deadlier than dogfighting. The threat spectrum ran from pistols to 88s, and a single rifle shot could shred a control line or find a pilot. Here, the Jug's architecture earned its keep. No liquid cooling to drain, armor around the cockpit, and a 2,400-pound radial that doubled as a frontal shield when flowing straight into ground fire. Dive recovery flak standardized pullouts when pilots had to go steep to beat tracers and clutter, giving a known feel near compressibility where earlier airframes could turn traitor in the last 100 feet. Sustainment closed the loop. Turnarounds were as decisive as tactics. Big ammo bays, generous access panels, and quick engine change modules kept the airplane a logistics problem, not a mystery, so ground echelons measured downtime in hours and days, not weeks. Standardized prop and turbo servicing let fields handle paddle blade improvements and regulator quirks without sending airframes away, so upgrades flowed into combat instead of idling in depots. The result was not just resilience but routine, the exact quality that starves an opponent faster than any heroics ever could. Why the 850s were the right hammer? Cannon shells deliver spectacular one-hits, but the Jug's philosophy put lethality into density and time. 8 guns, deep belts, and harmonization around 300 yards made brief, imperfect angles pay out like perfect ones on film. Against soft-skinned trucks and lightly armored rolling stock, API and API-T belts were decisive. Against aircraft, a 6-foot convergence zone often looked like cannon-like on film because multiple small hits broke structure at once. Commanders don't buy weapons for the best pilot on the best day. They buy for the average pilot on a long day, and the Thunderbolt's battery turned average into enough repeatedly. The Luftwaffe couldn't answer the tempo. German units tried to catch escorts or pounce on fighter bombers low, but altitude stacks and timing denied mass, and every interception bled pilots who were harder to replace than trains. Meanwhile, each day's ledger added locomotives, cars, junctions, and bridges to the list of things that could not be used by daylight, and morale studies later found fatigue and apathy compounding the physical loss. It's hard to launch a counterattack when the road is a kill zone and the rail yard is a memory. What success looked like? Logistics measured hours a yard stayed down, days a span took to patch, and how often convoys were pushed to night movement, slower, riskier, and easier to pre-sight. Corps commanders measured momentum, fewer counterpunches arriving with fuel and ammunition, fewer armored companies at the crucial crossroads. Pilots measured it in chalk dust, sorties flown, tanks dropped, rails cut, bursts fired, with the next day's targets already scrawled before the guns cooled. Why the P-47 owned this mission? A high-altitude engine that didn't fade at 30,000 feet, a cockpit that made aiming natural, guns that converted tracking time into outcomes, and structure that forgave human error, that combination made the Jug synonymous with daylight interdiction. Add paper tanks to be present longer, HVARs to make hard targets soft, dive recovery flaps so deep exits were survivable, and maintenance that turned damage into a short pause rather than a long absence. Simply put, the P-47 let air planners treat strangling an enemy's movement as a schedule.
After the beachhead held, Thunderbolts turned operational tempo into a weapon, treating northern France and then the Low Countries as a living network of targets to be cut on schedule. Bridges before dawn, marshalling yards at noon, and road junctions by dusk, so movement itself became a gamble in daylight. 9th Air Force fused pre-planned strikes with on-call tasking from forward controllers, ensuring rail cuts and road ambushes landed when ground units needed them, not just when the weather and brief permitted. Armed reconnaissance was a route with priorities, not a wandering hunt. Flight swept between choke points, watched for track marks, dust, smoke, and reflections, then split into elements to work multiple nodes while staying within radio reach for retask. Done right, each cut compounded the last. Blown spans forced detours, severed rails demanded transshipment, and ruined road junctions made detours into traps the ground commander already planned to spring. What made this sustainable was the Jug itself. A GE turbosupercharger kept sea-level lungs above 25,000 feet, so the same type could climb an escort, jettison tanks, drop to treetop for strikes, and climb out again through flak belts with manifold pressure in hand. With a service ceiling near 42,000 feet, P-47s stacked top cover over ingress routes and the bomb line, forcing any Luftwaffe massing through a layered gauntlet before it ever saw the heavies or the fighter bombers. Range stopped just being an escort statistic once British-built 108-gallon paper tanks hung under the wings. Paired with a 150-gallon belly tank when needed, they let Jug flights be present, re-attack, and still have fuel to climb back to safe air. Squadrons choreographed it. Step climb on externals, rendezvous at altitude, jettison under cover, then controlled dives to rails and road hubs, repeated until the day's map looked like a checklist of finished work. The loadouts were an engineer's answer to logistics. 2 500-pound GP bombs handled most spans. A 1,000-pounder centerline shocked heavier masonry. And late-war zero-length stubs let pilots fire up to 10 5-inch HVARs to tear rails, bunkers, and abutments in seconds. HVARs delivered a 105mm class hit from a stable gun platform. Even a near miss could cut rails or shatter ballast enough to derail repairs and force traffic into pre-sighted detours where follow-on flights waited. And through it all, 8 Browning AN-M250 calibers with roughly 425 rounds per gun, about 3,400 total, gave the sortie endurance and firepower, turning a short tracking window into a long ledger of perforations and ignitions. Harmonization set bullet streams to meet near 300 yards in a 6-foot circle. Pilots learned to fly the Pipper through the cone, because massed small-caliber hits often broke structure like cannon did. On film, you see wings fold and tails step off at the root. Killing trains was a 3-step craft. Rupture the boiler first to kill motion, suppress the mid-consist flak car, then rake cars with API and tracer so cargo and morale burned together. Best practice was a right-angle cross to simplify deflection and minimize exposure, followed by an immediate low egress to outrun steam, shrapnel, and point defense tracers erupting in the lane just flown. Against armored flak cars or stout spans, HVARs supplied the margin. And if the first pass didn't finish the job, paper tanks on ingress made sure there was gas to reset, re-attack, and confirm the cut before handing the node to follow-ons. Road columns were cut and rake, a bomb on the mid-column to stop it, APIT down the front and rear to cage it, then repeated passes until the road was its own barricade, and engineers had to clear fire before clearing wreckage. Strafing was often deadlier than dogfighting. The threat spectrum ran from pistols to 88s, and a single rifle shot could sever a control line or find a pilot in a way film crews never saw coming. Here the Jug's architecture earned its keep.
a 20,000-plus horsepower radial with no coolant to lose, armor behind the seat, bullet-resistant glass ahead, and structure that came home tattered but alive instead of failing at the first leak. Dive recovery flaps standardized pullouts when pilots had to go steep to beat tracers and clutter, turning the high-speed edge from a rumor into a repeatable control feel that saved airplanes that once ran out of elevator. And when the airplane did come back shot up, QEC engine modules, big ammo bays, and generous access panels turned damage into downtime measured in hours and days, not weeks. Weather slowed the schedule, but rarely broke it. Low ceilings pushed armed reconnaissance beneath cloud. Short-notice Sunday punches found brief holes over strong points, and pre-briefed rail cuts still flew when the overcast allowed. Forward airstrips opened within a day of D-Day, trading long-channel limps for short hops, raising sortie rates, and keeping on-station time where ground commanders needed it most. In this tempo, armored counterblows like Mortan found their roads closed when they needed them open, and their bridges down when they needed them up. A rhythm 9th Air Force tactical reports recorded with the calm of a checklist. German morale studies later captured the other ledger. Fatigue, apathy, and work slowdowns under persistent air threat compounded the material loss rail and road interdiction created. The Luftwaffe tried to answer by bouncing escorts or pouncing on fighter bombers low, but altitude stacks and timing denied mass, and every interception bled pilots who were harder to replace than trains. Even when Bodenplatte shattered aircraft on the ground months later, Allied fields backfilled machines in days, while German Gruppen never backfilled veterans. A strategic truth the interdiction only made more expensive with each day of delay. By autumn, daylight logistics in the West looked like a thesis in failure under observation. Move and be seen and be cut and be late and lose the initiative. And the Jug, built to aim rather than dance, gave air planners a tool that made that chain of cause and effect reliable across weather, geography, and the changing shape of the front. Why the P-47 owned this mission is a short list that hides a long war. Altitude power that didn't fade at 30,000 feet, a cockpit that made aiming natural, guns that converted tracking time into outcomes, and structure that forgave human error and enemy fire both. Add paper tanks to arrive and stay, HVARs to make hard targets soft, dive recovery flaps so steep exits were survivable, and maintenance doctrine that turned the airplane into a logistics problem solvable at a forward strip. Simply put, the Jug let commanders schedule the strangulation of movement instead of praying for it, and once a war lets you schedule outcomes, the other side stops having a plan and starts having a calendar. By late 1944, the air war had a new shape. German jets could outrun anything on a straight line, but Thunderbolt pilots discovered two reliable answers: catch them on takeoff or landing, or dive from high cover and shoot before the speed gap returned. That logic birthed the sprint-tuned P-47M, a late D-series derivative optimized for higher top speed with water injection and refined aerodynamics so formations could punish opportunities around jet bases. It wasn't about drag racing Me-262s in level flight, it was about timing, patience, altitude, and 850s delivering a short, fatal burst when a jet was energy poor. Major George Bostrick of the 63rd Fighter Squadron showed the method on March 25, 1945, scoring on a Me-262 near the pattern, an interception born of altitude control, pattern awareness, and a dive window jets couldn't claw back from fast enough. Across 1944 to 45, claims against Me-262s came from these patterns more than from mid-air chases, with P-47M units trained to watch for liftoff cues, final turn geometry, and the exact distance where 850s could write the last line. Meanwhile, standard D-series Thunderbolts carried the heavier lift of escort and ground attack, letting the M variants specialize in a hunting role the theater now demanded. For the Luftwaffe, The calendar hurt more than the cockpit. Operation Bodenplatte, January 1, 1945, threw roughly 850 fighters at Allied airfields in a desperate low-level strike meant to shatter tactical air power on the ground. Germany lost about 271 fighters and 213 fighter pilots killed or missing, losses its training pipeline and fuel stockpiles could not replace, while Allied units backfilled aircraft within days and resumed the schedule. Even generous counts of Allied aircraft written off underscored the asymmetry. Factories and depots refilled hardstands, but the Luftwaffe never refilled experience. The Jug's endurance in this phase came from the same choices made in 1940 to 41. A turbo-supercharged R-2800 that still had breath at 30,000 feet, structure that forgave damage, and a weapons suite that turned short windows into decisive shots. Dive recovery flaps and the dorsal fin fillet standardized behavior in the high-speed edge cases, so pilots could use the airplane's vertical gifts without bargaining with compressibility. And because production folded improvements into block runs, squadrons received upgrades alongside replacement airframes, keeping the line's capability synchronized with the war's demands. The Pacific Stretch, the P-47N's long wing. Where Europe needed stacked altitude and sprint windows, the Central Pacific asked a different question. How far can you go, fight, and still come home across ocean? The answer was the P-47N, wet wings holding about 93 gallons each, a longer span, and fuel totals that, with externals, stretched range to roughly 2,350 miles, enough to escort B-29s and sweep between island bases. It kept the Jug's character, 850s, a tough radial, and stability that made a bomb and rocket platform feel like flying artillery, while giving planners endurance on maps measured in water, not roads. Pacific sorties demanded fuel discipline and boredom tolerance as much as gunnery. Long climbs, long cruise legs, then sudden violence over a target that had to be finished before the weather or fuel closed the window. The N's wing and fuel architecture answered with cruise economy and stability, so pilots could arrive with options, deliver ordnance, and decide whether to stay lethal for a re-attack or leave with altitude and minutes to spare. It was the Jug's final form in wartime, a long-range brawler that made distance part of the weapon and brought the same repeatability to oceanic geography that the D-series brought to France. What the ledger meant by spring 1945. The calendar in Europe was nearly done. Jets were dangerous, but windows still existed, and the Luftwaffe's pilot losses and fuel shortages kept shrinking their chances to exploit their machines' speed. On the ground, interdiction and close support had turned daylight movement into a euphemism for risk, with P-47s using bombs, rockets, and .50s to convert crossroads and rail yards into schedule disruptions the enemy could not afford. The Jug's altitude cards still mattered. Escorts high, strikes low, egress back up, and the ability to do both in a single type simplified planning across crowded skies. By then, the question wasn't whether the P-47 could win a duel. It was whether it could keep winning the schedule, turning industrial throughput, pilot training, and predictable airframes into a grind that finished the war's arithmetic. It did this without romance. Access panels, QEC engines, warm guns, and predictable flaps, details that meant back on the line tomorrow was not a hope but an appointment. If a single design philosophy ties the Jug's last chapters together, it's this: altitude, energy, and firepower are only decisive if they are present when needed, and the P-47 was built to be present. In Europe, the P-47M punished moments jets could not afford to offer, and in the Pacific, the P-47N turned miles into something you could plan around, while the D series kept doing the daily work of escort, interdiction, and close support that made advances stick. The airplane that began as a flying milk bottle ended as a system, engineering, production, training, and tactics that let ordinary crews schedule outcomes in a war that punished improvisation. In that sense, the Jug's last miles were not an epilogue, but a proof. Build for altitude, build for firepower, build for repair, and you build for victory on a calendar rather than by accident.
By VE Day, the numbers behind the P-47 told a story of design choices that scaled. Roughly 15,683 Thunderbolts built, the most of any American fighter. A service ceiling near 42,000 feet. 8 .50 caliber Brownings with about 3,400 rounds on board. And block-by-block improvements folded into production so squadrons received upgrades as steadily as replacements. Those figures mattered because they mapped to behaviors commanders could schedule. Escorts stacked high where the turbosupercharger still had breath. Dives that turned seconds into decisions. And low-level strikes that closed roads and rails as a matter of routine rather than luck. In a war that punished improvisation and rewarded repetition, the Thunderbolt's architecture, radio resilience, generous access for maintenance, dive recovery flaps, dorsal fillet, bubble canopy, turned individual skill into repeatable results across hundreds of groups and thousands of sorties. On the Ground Wars calendar, 9th Air Force used jugs to cut arteries at daybreak, hammer strong points at noon, and shut junctions by dusk, while forward controllers diverted flights to whatever threatened tempo that afternoon. Paper wing tanks and step climbs made reattacks a feature, not a luxury. And the 8-gun battery's deep belts meant a pilot could afford to be human, take a second pass, correct the pipper, finish the job. The effect on German movement was cumulative. Daylight logistics turned into risk management. Morale studies logged fatigue and apathy under constant air threat. And commanders discovered that a road with eyes overhead is not a road, it's a bet. In the last European winter, Operation Bodenplatte showed the limits of shock without sustainment. Around 271 German fighters and 213 fighter pilots lost in a single morning. Aircraft that Allied depots replaced in days, but pilots the Luftwaffe never replaced at all. Squadron diaries read matter-of-factly in early January 1945. Sorties resumed, lines refilled, upgrades continued, because the industrial cycle that fed jugs to forward fields had become as relentless as the tactics those jugs executed. Air superiority at noon is built at midnight on workstands. The P-47's maintainability and part stream made that truism a daily reality. Jets complicated the last months, but didn't rewrite them. Me-262s set new speeds, yet P-47M squadrons learned to punish patterns. Takeoff and landing windows, and steep dives from high cover where a short, dense burst beat acceleration every time. It was a hunter's discipline, not a sprinter's ego, and it fit a group system already trained to wait at altitude, strike on time, and leave with energy in hand. Meanwhile, the D series carried the heavier daily work, escort, interdiction, close support, showing why a platform built around altitude, firepower, and survivability could flex without losing identity. Across the ocean, the P-47N answered a different question, distance, with wet wings, longer span, and cruise economy that turned 2,000-mile maps from peril into planning. It kept the Jug's personality, 850s, stable ordnance carriage, and a cockpit that made aiming natural, so island hopping could be flown with the same confidence Normandy had taught. The lesson traveled well. Endurance is a weapon if the airplane that carries it still fights like a fighter at the far end. What the Jug finally proved was simple and unfashionable. Build for altitude where decisions start. Build for firepower that forgives imperfect moments. Build for repair so tomorrow is guaranteed, and you can turn strategy into a schedule. The P-47 didn't win by elegance. It won by being present,
with power, with guns, with pilots who could trust the machine, and crews who could keep it ready. In that presence lay terror for those who heard its approach, and comfort for those who counted on its return, which is exactly what a wartime machine exists to deliver.
Ask the men who flew and fought against the P-47, and a theme returns. The Thunderbolt was not merely a fast, heavy fighter, it was a system that made survival and destruction repeatable under pressure. Robert S. Johnson's legend began with a shredded jug that would not die, but his real testimony is what followed: 27 victories by a pilot who learned to aim the airplane like a weapon and trust its strength. Across squadrons, that trust became doctrine. Climb high on the turbosupercharger's curve, dive with discipline, fire through a 6-foot convergence at roughly 300 yards, and exit with enough energy to decide the next move. In museums today, the P-47 story is told with placards and parts that explain the logic behind the legend. A service ceiling near 42,000 feet, 8 50-caliber Brownings with about 3,400 rounds, and a cockpit that turned deflection into a practiced craft. The National Air and Space Museum's P-47D-30 stands as a template: bubble canopy for sight, dorsal fin fillet for stability, and dive recovery flaps that made high-speed pullouts predictable rather than perilous. USAF fact sheets echo what wartime flyers already knew. Altitude power, structural resilience, and belt-fed firepower were not trivia. They were the reason sorties ended in film strips and safe landings. Adolphe Gallant's later reflections acknowledged the misread. The P-47 wasn't a bomber called a fighter, but an American answer built around production, survivability, and overwhelming, repeatable fire. By the time late-war jets appeared, Jagdwaffe units faced an ecosystem: escorts stacked high, fighter bombers timed to ground thrusts, and factories that turned shock into a short delay rather than a lasting reversal. Operation Bodenplatte proved the point in a morning: hundreds of Allied aircraft damaged or destroyed, refilled in days. Hundreds of German fighters and irreplaceable pilots lost, never truly replaced. Walk the American Heritage Museum's Thunderbolt or the Evansville displays, and you see the other half of the narrative. The airplane's logistics are visible in the metal: big access panels, gun bays that invite hands, and power plants mounted for swaps, not ceremonies. Evansville is not just a footnote, it's where block changes became a cadence, so squadrons received better airplanes while they received new ones, knitting engineering into operations without a pause. That is why Back on the Line Tomorrow reads like dull prose in unit records. It was the planned outcome of design choices made in 1940 and executed in factories through 1945. The Jugs battery of 850s still invites debate from cannon partisans, but the gun camera film sustains the verdict. Density and duration can produce cannon-like breakups when structure absorbs many small, well-placed blows at once. Harmonization and belt composition, API, API-T, and ball were not just armorer habits, but tactical settings that matched mission profiles, from head-on snapshots to low raking passes against rail and road. In the ledger of war, what matters is not a perfect shot once, but a reliable shot again tomorrow. And the Jugs guns, feed, heat, and access delivered that reliability to average pilots on long days. Beneath the glass, the dorsal fin fillet and dive recovery flap can seem anonymous, but they are the difference between a dive you survive and a dive you tell stories about. Engineering that converts courage into outcomes instead of cautionary tales. The same is true of the turbosupercharger plumbing, a cathedral of ducts and intercooler runs that looks like weight until you read the altimeter and see why decisions start above 25,000 feet. These are the quiet parts of a loud airplane, the pieces that let the pilot be human without paying for small errors with irreplaceable skill.
If the European chapters defined the Jug by altitude and attrition, the Pacific's P-47N proves the design's elasticity. Long, wet wings for fuel, a steadier cruise, and the same 8 guns when the map turned blue. Endurance as a weapon is more than a slogan. It's the idea that arriving with options changes the moral geometry of a fight, because a pilot who can afford another pass can also afford to be precise. That, too, is a museo lesson. Range and reliability are strategic virtues only if the airplane still fights like a fighter at the far end. As a memory, the P-47 is easy to caricature. Heavy, rugged, loud, the flying tank that oozed confidence. And yet the deeper truth is that it made a difficult war legible to planners and survivable to crews. It taught airmen that altitude is a decision, that maintenance is a tactic, and that a gun battery is a clock you learn to read as intimately as a friend's face. It taught opponents that mocking mass is safer than meeting it. So when people say the Jug wasn't pretty, they mean it didn't flatter vanity. It flattered schedules, and schedules win wars. When they say it wasn't nimble, they mean it saved nimbleness for the moment that mattered, then wrote the rest of the conversation in .50 caliber grammar. And when they say it wasn't the star, they mean it was the show, the noise you felt in your ribs before you saw the flash, and the shadow that stooped from high sky and made the day go the way the chalkboard said it would.